But tonight, we are gathered to hear some of the work of our dear scholar in residence, George Conyne. He returns to us, born and raised in Bucks County, though he's been in England for many years. He's a member of Wrightstown's Friends Meeting. He holds an undergraduate degree in history from Haverford and a law degree from Tulane. He went on to earn his PhD at Cambridge in 1989 and remained in England for most of his career. He's taught American history, American studies, and 20th century British history in English universities, principally the University of Kent in Canterbury. George retired from teaching in 2018 and has been active in Canterbury Friends meetings, serving as assistant clerk and elder until coming to Pendle Hill in January 2019 as our Kenneth Carroll Scholar. George will be speaking tonight on his research, A Few Exceptions, Philadelphia Quakers, and the Civil War. We will have time for question and answer at the end of the evening. Just welcome everyone and welcome George.
Thank you and good evening. I've been invited this evening to speak to you about the research I've started at Pendle Hill as a Kenneth Carroll Scholar. Professor Carroll was born in Talbot County on the eastern shore of Maryland, but after his studies at Duke, where he became a Quaker, he taught at Southern Methodist University in Dallas from 1952 to 1986. He specialized in Quakerism in early colonial Maryland, but also served as clerk of South Central Yearly Meeting and assistant treasurer of Friends World Consultative Committee. He retired back to Talbot County, where he served as clerk of Third Haven Friends Meeting and as president of the Friends Historical Association, and continued publishing, eventually contributing a lifetime total of nearly 70 articles that reflect a precise mind and a deep understanding of Quakerism and colonial Maryland. I'm honored to have been appointed to the scholarship. My interest in my subject tonight started some time ago, in the late 1960s, when, as a boy in first day school at Wrightstown Friends Meeting in Bucks County, I was assured that, during the Civil War, Quakers did not fight. Period. Although I was about 9 at the time, and like my teacher, I was skeptical. Because in the meeting's spacious graveyard, and Wrightstown has one of the largest Quaker graveyards I've ever seen in my life, there were numerous veterans organizations markers that indicated that the men buried there had fought in various wars. And I checked through very carefully and saw the Spanish-American War, World War I, World War II, Korea, and Vietnam were all represented, as was the Civil War. So unless there were a very large number of Civil War veterans who suddenly became Quakers after the end of the Civil War, which seems unlikely to me now as it does then, something is wrong here. I'm not saying that my teacher doctored the record, or much less that the great Rufus Jones, who I read when I was at Haverford, was simply wrong. But I discovered he concluded largely in the same way, possibly with a few trivial exceptions, is how he termed the number of the men who fought or did not fight. But nowhere such numbers as to disturb the basic conclusion that Quakers in general accepted the belief structures in the clash of the 1860s and did not fight. None of the interest I had brought to this seeming contradiction led me, however, to study it in depth over the years since. One of the pleasures of my historical interest is that I find all sorts of areas fascinating. But that meant that I devoted my studying of history to legal history, diplomatic history, political history, among other areas. But this scholarship has allowed me to return to a question that I never have forgotten, although I hadn't truly addressed it until now. For not only is it an interesting question in the history of Quakerism, It is also a very rare example of how an egalitarian religion, or any group, deals with the difficulties that arise when two major elements of their general strictures, here pacifism and the defense of egalitarianism, belief structures simply clash. As many in 1861 concluded, many Quakers in 1861, because they believed that slavery would never die out, as many tried to argue that it would, and fought as a result, or supported the war effort. So studying how a society, especially a society that is so literate and well educated, and especially among women, of course, in the 19th century, is important from a general sociological perspective, as well as its understanding in the Quaker history of the time. I also regretfully have to offer a disclaimer. Over the years, I have winced when the speaker started out with, "This is a work in progress." Too often, half done meant the intellectual equivalent of half baked. And so, with all the unattractive results that half baked suggests, it is an act of convenient catch-all cover and excuse. All manner of comment, be it incomplete or simply wrong, can simply be defended by, "Oh, it's a work in progress." So the audience can leave this place with no more certain knowledge than when they entered. I'm not sure I can avoid those problems, but I will try. And I have been in audiences suffering from this too often, not to try as hard as I can to offer some certainty as the matter. What I can say is that I have read the Philadelphia Yearly and most of the quarterly meeting minutes, Hicksite and Orthodox, and the small progressive branch as well, from the war years 1861 to 1865. I have also read a relatively random selection of monthly meetings for business, or should I say minutes, monthly meetings for business, across the meetings that comprise Philadelphia Yearly meetings. I have read the minutes of meetings for sufferings across Philadelphia. I have reviewed all three Philadelphia-based Quaker journals of the time, all of which were weeklies, 16 pages, tabloid format. And they are, of course, the Hicksite Friends Intelligencer, the Gurneyite Orthodox The Friend, and the Wilburite Orthodox The Friends Review. I have read the minutes of the meetings for sufferings of the Philadelphia Yearly meeting. These dealt with specific problems that couldn't wait until the Philadelphia Yearly meeting to be addressed. I've also just finished reading New York Yearly meeting minutes, which are useful to me tonight because they show how another yearly meeting addressed and reacted to the problems, similar to those faced by Philadelphia Yearly meeting. So that's what I've managed so far. There is, however, lots left to do. The Religious Society of Friends, of course, has always loomed large in American colonial history. It is rightly given attention, both as a persecuted minority in Massachusetts and elsewhere, but also, of course, the founders of the proprietary colony of Pennsylvania, and, probably more importantly, founders of the largest and richest city in Anglophone America, Philadelphia. In the midst of this great financial and commercial success, the society withdrew from its central role in political affairs of the city and county. This arose because of the philosophical conflicts and problems that arose out of the French and Indian Wars. When it came to the colonial legislatures realized that they would have to increase taxes and spending in order to conduct the war, the conundrum was clear. Quakers were distinctive enough from most other Christian faiths and well known for their peace testimony, by which they placed the well-known passage of the New Testament shunning war and its implements, that is, Matthew chapter 5, verses 38 to 48, and the Sermon on the Mount. Famous terms like live by the sword, put up your sword, and from James, from whence come wars, from Corinthians, we do not war after the flesh, and against those tried to make a life in a practical sense. This constant tension led to the decision to withdraw from the legislature in about 1760. It occurred over a number of years. And to this day, there have only been a few Quakers who served in high public office. They continued to exert substantial economic and philanthropic power, and the best known of these interests was the rising opposition to members holding slaves in the late 18th century. African slavery had long caused problems for Quakers. George Fox concluded ahead of many in his time that they had souls and therefore were fully human. William Penn took an enlightened 17th century view and wanted to ban slavery, but establish indentured servitude as the way to structure a subservient labor force. But indentured servitude proved unworkable in Pennsylvania, as it had elsewhere, so that African slavery took hold. Division among friends did not, of course, go away. Year after year in the debate over slavery, John Woolman and Anthony Benezet endlessly agitated for it. In 1758, the Yearly Meeting established its opposition to the slave importation law. As in Africa, slaves were often losers in wars, and therefore trading in slaves was assisting in war. As such, to continue to allow importation of wars supported those wars, and so it was banned. In 1775, Benezet established the first anti-slavery society under the name redolent of its time. I can't resist this. The Philadelphia Society for the Relief of Free Negroes Unlawfully Held in Bondage was the name of the first anti-slavery society. Philadelphia Yearly Meeting banned slavery from its membership in the next year, and the now independent Commonwealth of Pennsylvania followed in 1780. This provided for immediate end of the importation of slaves, but gradual emancipation for those already enslaved. Children born as slaves after the acts passed were free, but this made it the first state to pass freedom statute of any kind, although it of course left slaves who were already born as slaves. After Benezet died in 1784, Benjamin Franklin, who owned slaves steadily, succeeded him and oversaw the renaming of the society as the Pennsylvania Society for the Promotion and Abolition of Slavery and for the Relief of Free Negroes Unlawfully Held in Bondage. The divisions friends faced over slavery were overshadowed by the deep and immediate division caused by the American Revolution. The central question of the Revolution, who would rule over American colonies, as not in theory of institutional concern to the Society of Friends in 1776, but of course it involved Quakers in every conceivable way. Over 1,700 Quakers were disowned for taking up arms, overwhelmingly to fight against the British. Friends, in effect, had a 5-point program: neutrality, no involvement, support any peace move by either side, and refusal to pay war taxes. And 5, recording all losses with the meanings of sufferings to create a record that would serve as a basis for compensation when cooler heads prevailed after the war. Almost inevitably, not all agreed. Some Quakers decided to fight, including General Thomas Mifflin, the quartermaster, and Nathaniel Greene, who arguably was Washington's best subordinate, and who was read out of meeting even before the war because he was too vehement in his views supporting the rebellion. And in Philadelphia, a band of revolutionary supporters, including apparently Betsy Ross, broke away and founded the Free Quaker Meeting that lasted another half-century. 20 Quaker loyalists petitioned the Crown for compensation for economic losses on their own side, and so all the support didn't fall on one side or the other. Quakers were divided. It's difficult to tell how many supported which side over the long term, because after 1783, many meetings adopted a forgive and forget policy under which, After an apology and a request for forgiveness, the individual or family was readmitted to membership. But during the war, a far more significant change occurred. In 1780, as I mentioned, Pennsylvania passed the first emancipation law. It provided that immediate freedom for those yet born, and would have been struck down as illegal almost undoubtedly had it attempted to free slaves, because it still would have been seen as a abrogation of property. So the children of slaves could be free, but no adult could be. When a ban on the importation of slaves was added, the result was, as I said, gradual emancipation. The first census found that there were 10,000 blacks in the Commonwealth, of whom 3,700 were still enslaved, and that declined to 64 by 1840. 7 years later, it was ended altogether. It's probably right here to remind people about the status of slavery during the early national period. There are about 700,000 slaves in a population of 3.9 million, or 18% in 1790. For these purposes, the country was easily and rightly divided into three: New England, the South, and the Mid-Atlantic states, including New York, New Jersey, and Pennsylvania. The three states in New England outside of Massachusetts, which then included Maine, had some 4,000 slaves, Massachusetts and Maine having none. But this was only about 1% of the population. The southern states were quite different and had very large populations, led by South Carolina, whose population was about 43% slave. No slave had a majority. In the Mid-Atlantic states, there were different still. The effect of Pennsylvania emancipation means that by 1790, only 1% of slaves 1% of blacks were enslaved in the state, while in New Jersey and New York, the populations were about 6% enslaved. New York passed a gradual abolition law similar to Pennsylvania's in 1799, and New Jersey followed in 1804. So there was still a small number of slaves in the North really until the 1840s. Slave ownership has always been concentrated, another misapprehension. Only about 20% of Southerners ever held slaves, and only 20% of slaveholders, so therefore about 2% of the whole Southern population, held more than 20 slaves. In other words, the world of Gone with the Wind is the exception, not the rule. Most slaves were household servants who worked closely with white families nearby, in the barn, the stable, the house, whatever. So the point is that Pennsylvania in the late 1850s, slavery was no longer at hand, but it was not far away, being well established in Delaware and Maryland, or had lately been extant both in Pennsylvania and New Jersey. Furthermore, slavery's face was a type of household service rather than the impersonal distance between master and servant typified by plantation slavery. While the United States was, of course, deeply split over slaves, Quakers were not, having eradicated it in the meeting in 1776. They, of course, divided on other things, to which I refer to the 1827 split in Quakers between the Hicksites and the Orthodox. This theological division between Quakers, which lasted another 125 years, need not bother us particularly because they were united over slavery. Their differences were on other issues. But it does remind us, the Hicksite Orthodox division, of the extent to which antebellum Society of Friends was a dynamic institution. It is so often seen as a static institution. It's a dynamic and changing one throughout the 1820s, 30s, and 40s on a whole variety of issues. It's important also to remember what Quakerism was. I was saying at dinner that in some ways it is almost an unrecognizable religion to the one we have today. The object of Quakerism was how to live a godly life in a world full of ungodliness. Preparation of the self was the key. So the issue for these Quakers, and it's shown over and over again in the work I've done and the papers that are available, is that the issue was not concerned with peace in the world, but the concern was with peace within oneself. Internal peace was the issue. The argument ran that world peace meant nothing if you were not at peace within yourself. And if you were at peace with yourself, you could deal with the lack of peace in the world. So the issues of Quakerism, in other words, in the antebellum period, are all inward-looking, are internal. They're saving oneself. And you see this replicated over and over again, both in the minutes of meeting, as well as in the themes that run through the newspapers that they are producing. Constantly, it's the issue of the self. It's not questions of social reform that grace the pages of those newspapers. It is, in fact, issues like developments in natural science. There's a tremendous line in botany, I can tell you right now, in those newspapers. As they are watching the people, our deepening understanding of the world, but not at a social level. This, it seems to me, is straight out of Fox. Because Fox, 100 years earlier, of course, was a pre-Enlightenment thinker. And does not reflect, in other words, a deep concern for the social reform all around him. He was concerned with the inner life of the self. That concern for social reform in the world around us, it seems to me, comes substantially later. But still, it was a time of change. The disownments, which were so common in the 19th century for all sorts of things, drinking alcohol, marrying outside of meeting, marrying into the wrong branch of Quakerism, those disownments drop off substantially in the 1840s and 50s. There is investigations of individuals for having transgressed the terms of the Book of Discipline. There's one delightfully obtuse investigation of a fornicator, but there's no disownment at the end of it. It's very clear that it was proved, but there's no disownment at the end of it. So that all of a sudden, these issues which had been so deeply, of such deep concern, with such tragic consequences in many ways, in the religion, simply are no longer that important anymore. An apology is given, contrition is summoned, and that's about it. And as for marrying out, which is very common, Hicksite wasn't supposed to marry an Orthodox. Orthodox was supposed to marry a Hicksite Quaker. By 1862, the forms that Philadelphia Yearly Meeting sends out to produce a census return, counting all the Quakers in the Delaware Valley, more or less, leave a space for the number of school children in the first column who have 2 Quaker parents, and the number of school children under Quaker care that only have 1 Quaker parent. Well, since the second column is very often a third or a half of the first column numerically, it's very clear that there are an awful lot of Quakers who are marrying out and are still very much a part of the Quaker world, in houses, in meeting houses, and schools and meeting houses and so on. So this is a time of change. You can say that, and with some justification, that it's a lowering of standards, that they're not as strict as they have been, but it is certainly, it seems to me, a time of change. And that is important, crucially important in my opinion, to understanding the Quaker reaction to the Civil War. Another great misapprehension, along with slave ownership, about this period concerns the abolitionists. William William Faulkner one time derisively referred to the treasury of virtue that the North always had believed that it had. Northerners still to this day assume that all Northerners were abolitionists. Not only is that not true, but the truth is that a few, small, perhaps only a percentage in the single digits, were abolitionists. The vast majority of the population saw abolition in the late 1850s and in 1860 as anything other than extreme position and rejected it. And this includes the members of the Society of Friends. To Quakers, abolitionists advocated violent measures to end slavery, and that was simply unacceptable. Slavery would either have to die out or be legislated out of existence by individual states. Fortunately for politically minded Quakers, the Republican Party acted from its founding in 1854 as an umbrella coalition of those opposed to slavery to any extent. In 1860, the principal candidates for its nomination was the moderate Abraham Lincoln, who publicly declared that he only opposed the expansion of slavery into the territories, and said repeatedly that he would not move against slavery in the 15 states where it had been enacted. But he started the race and entered the convention as the underdog to William Seward, senator from New York, who delighted abolitionists with his view of an irrepressible conflict between the free states and the slave states. But Lincoln upset Seward and won the election, but with only 39% of the vote. No one has ever been elected president with a smaller percentage of the electoral vote, of the popular vote, than Abraham Lincoln. It was the strangest political election in American history. Say what you will about 2016, that's still true. Because Lincoln faced Stephen A. Douglas, the Democratic candidate, but they only got votes in the North. John Breckinridge, who was the Southern Democrat, pro-slavery Democrat, faced John Bell, who tried to finesse the issue by not talking about slavery at all in the South, and they got virtually no votes in the North. So it was as if there were two candidates fighting the election in the North, two other candidates fighting the election in the South, and they had nothing to do with each other. Lincoln wins the election because he gets all the electoral votes in the North, more or less. He defeated Douglas by small margins across the North. Lincoln's platform was of limited opposition to slavery, and it served as an umbrella that united disparate groups of people who could agree that slavery was bad, but could not agree on what ought to be done about it. In this way, the party appears to reflect the split of American Quakerism, but at least so far that holds in my research. I have found little real differences in the branches of Quakerism on the central issue. But at times there's a difference of tone and a difference of style. The Hicksite Journal, Friends Intelligencer, reported more general political news in its weekly columns than either the Orthodox Journal, journals, the Gurneyite, the Friend, and the Wilburite, the Friend's Review, as their writers wrote reflecting the depths of the split. For much of the writing is written as though the organization and the other branch of Quakerism simply didn't exist. They just ignore each other. In one of the extraordinarily rare mentions of the other branch, phrases are used such as the so-called Orthodox meetings. That's over a land dispute of who actually gets control of the meeting house in a particular place. So as a result, for clarity's sake, I will mention whether or not I'm talking about a Hicksite or an Orthodox meeting, but it really has very little effect in the long run of this issue. What one notices immediately in the minutes of yearly, quarterly, and monthly meetings, as well as in these journals I've mentioned, is what little comment there actually is. The Friend repeatedly reported without comment the major events that now seem monumental to the historians of this period. Lincoln's election, South Carolina secession, the secession of the 6 deep southern states that followed after South Carolina, The Friends Intelligencer gave its readership little more than basic information, but the Wilburite Friends Review offered an editorial supporting the well-known proposal for federally compensated emancipation of slavery as a way of ending the dispute. Although this would have solved the Quaker conflict of how slavery could be ended without violence, it never got a formal consideration in Congress, much less was it ever likely to pass. The cost, possibly $4 or $5 billion, that's about 125 billion in current money, would have been prohibitive. On average, the government's expenditures in these years was about 170 million a year. So you can see that the expenditure of 4 or 5 billion was just phenomenally large, larger than could ever have been contemplated. So that's the conundrum which faces the country at the time. In fact, the Friend, in a rare, very rare editorial, just a month before Lincoln becomes president, opines that, quote, both parties admit that the main point of the disagreement respecting slavery is an abstract right, by which it means that the argument appears to be only over slavery in the territories, in the Western territories, and that geography would in the end determine whether or not there was to be slavery to be predominant in America or not. This is an interesting argument. It's widely heard at the time. And I think I should pause for a minute on it. This seems to refer to plantation slavery and not to the normal condition of the vast majority of slaves in the country who were, as I have said, either household servants or worked very closely, worked in the barn and stable, but not out in the fields. I fail to understand, and no one has ever been able to explain it to me, even though I have investigated this endlessly, how household slavery is dependent upon geography, when, of course, this sort of thing is seen all over the world, where people work for a little more than room and board in a house. It's hardly unique to the United States. But they certainly believe this. But this confusion, and it seems to me that's what it is, between plantation slavery and slavery generally, just constantly invades the discourse at this time. A week later, the Friend, in another unusual editorial, putting it mildly, complimented James Buchanan, who was being excoriated by almost everyone else in the country, for not having done anything during his last months as president. It pointed out that his refusal to stop the Confederates from taking over federal installations in the South meant that the country was still at peace. Of course, the historical community has faulted Buchanan and said that that merely encouraged the South to further acts against the country and made putting the rebellion down that much harder in the long run. But it is an unusual element that they're actually talking about slavery in the editorial columns. That in itself is an unusual event. Later that month, the Friends Review published the following item, titled, J.G. Whittier to William H. Seward. Statesman, I thank thee, and if yet dissent mingles reluctance with my large content, I cannot censure what was nobly meant, but constrained to hold even union less than liberty and truth and righteousness. I thank thee in sweet and holy name of peace for wise, calm words that put to shame passion and party. Courage may be shown, not in deflation of the wrong alone. He may be bravest who unweaponed bears the olive branch, the strong in justice spares. The rash wrongdoer giving widest scope to Christian charity and generous hope, of freedom and safeguard of its laws, if, without yielding that for which atone, we prize the union, thou canst save it not from a baptism of blood upon thy brow, a wreath whose flowers no earthly soil have known, woven with beatitudes shall rest, and the peacemaker shall be forever blessed. Whittier, of course, was one of the great poets of his day, and certainly the greatest Quaker poet, regardless of what you may have thought of that contribution. The criticism was heard even then that if Whittier had published fewer poems and spent more time on the ones he wrote, that he may have actually done better. But it's an important contribution, not the least of which is that it's addressed to Seward, not Lincoln. The assumption still was that Seward would run the government sort of in Lincoln's name, because Seward had the experience and Lincoln was just simply an ugly, backwoods rube who no one really understood or knew. It's a reminder, in other words, of the extent to which this was still an unknown president and an unknown party coming into office. Less elevated Quakers, of course, have their views, we only find their views by going through minutes of meetings. And the crucial element here, my lodestar in this part of the inquiry, is that when monthly meetings write to yearly meetings, or quarterly meetings write to yearly meetings, they structure the report around a series of queries, which are written down in the Book of Discipline, the predecessor to Faith and Practice. The sixth query reads, "Do you maintain a faithful testimony against oaths, hireling ministry, bearing of arms, training, and other military services? Are you concerned with any fraudulent or clandestine trade, buying or vending of goods, so including imported and prize goods, and against encouraging lotteries of any kind?" So, of course, sort of a laundry list of the things that they were found concerned about. It's interesting that they kind of view them all as roughly equal. Answers to this I have read at length. And it's remarkable that the idea is always the same, even if the wording is somewhat different as you go along. And the prototypical one actually comes from Fall's meeting in Bucks County. Our members have kept the testimony on war, but there are a few exceptions. We never find out what a few means. In any of it, no one ever defines the term few. With a few exceptions, we are told that care has been given. We're told that certain members have not been so guarded as they ought to have been. We are told that there has been a deficiency in the observance of the peace testimony, that it has not been sufficiently maintained, that there have been some violations, that because of the unhappy state of this country, some of our members have been led into failing to defend the testimony against war. I've read dozens, if not hundreds, of these sorts of mild circumlocutions, which never actually say how many members of the meeting, no numbers, much less what they've actually done, all across Philadelphia yearly meeting. What's striking is you go to New York yearly meeting, they're much more direct and blunt. They'll give you numbers, 3, 7, 9, whatever. They will occasionally subdivide what they've done, either giving aid to the Union Army or service themselves or whatever. But across Philadelphia, nice forms of words that really say little. Trying to figure out then how many men actually served, how many people actually supported the cause of the Union Army is very difficult. But it seems to me that a few has to be more than two. You wouldn't say few for two, that's few. As you go through the census list, they're very careful. They break down the census not only into how many men, how many women, but how many children of 0 to 5 years, 5 to 15, and 15 to 23. That's the group, of course, I'm interested in. Very often, that number is no more than 9 or 10 in a monthly meeting. So when we're talking about a few, if it is, say, 3 or 4, we may be talking about as much as 40 or 50% of the old boys, and I mean literally older boys, of the meeting going off to war. So although it is a few, which of course Rufus Jones faithfully quoted in his work, a few actually could quite reasonably be a quarter to a third. I leave this as an open mystery because I have yet to conclude, but it is striking, first, the unanimity of the vagueness, and it really is astonishing. I found exactly one number meeting in Chester County on one occasion. The clerk must have slipped up, but that's all I can do. But, as I said, there is this sense that they don't want to talk about it. I also conclude from that, I'll tell you right now, that this must have been immensely painful. And that the way the clerk gets around it is by using these terms of art and these vague terms that try to get around the whole point. Because of the divisions I suspect it must have caused. One area that was even more general, that was more than an annoyance for certain Quakers, is that, and this may come as a surprise to you, even before the war there was a militia tax, or a military tax as it's sometimes referred to. So that even in peacetime, Pennsylvanians were required to pay a military tax. It's, however, a rather peculiar tax. And frankly, I've never heard of a tax structured like this. The state didn't have to collect it. If it felt that it didn't need the money, it could delay collection for a year or more. If, after a period of non-collection, it decided it needed a lot of money, it could demand all of your back tax debt, even if it hadn't been demanded previously, immediately. So, as I said, I have never run across a tax like this before. But the tax was apparently routinely collected, but, and this is another astonishment, and I'm going to have to go into much greater depth if I really want to tackle this, it seems to be done rather, but geographically, quite sporadically. Meetings in Montgomery County, for instance, will sometimes say that there are a dozen people who have had the tax demanded and have been Quakers refused to pay. Whereas, same year, none in Bucks County. Which is just, to my mind, just defies imagination. My suspicion is that it varied county by county how much the county was required to pay, and that therefore, if the county had met that quota, it didn't necessarily go after everybody, whereas other counties, if they needed the money, then went after people. It's a very peculiar tax, very irregular. However, this is, as I said, sometimes Quakers are just so utterly predictable. You will get phrases saying that the clerk will report that the tax owed was $4.50, and that as a result that the constable has seized $5 worth of property, and that therefore it is recorded that the meeting will ask for 50 cents on behalf of the member. They follow this down literally to the last penny. And these are all in the record, sometimes at great length. And then at other times, it's as if the tax doesn't exist. It is one of the most peculiar things I've run across in terms of taxation, that there is such tremendous variety. But all of this very precise recording of it, including, and apparently this was a formula that they sent out, recording the name of the constable demanding the tax, as well as the commissioners on behalf of the state, the county commissioners on behalf of the state, who demanded it as well. So it's a very careful record, which is being made, apparently, for claims after the war. There are lots of remarks about, when the furies of fire die down. But then, having gone through the records of the late 1860s, there's no demand in peacetime. The meetings actually never demand their money back. Never make the claim that this was taken improperly and contrary to the religious concerns. I find not a single record of a meeting petitioning for the return of the money after the war. All very peculiar. The argument over whether or not to fight, of course, is an interesting philosophical one when it starts in 1861-62. And as I've said, it's already very clear that I think hundreds, if not thousands, of boys probably fought just from the Philadelphia area alone. Far in excess of what I think most scholars have traditionally argued. The complexion of it, however, changes dramatically when, as a result of the lack of the war's popularity, brought on perhaps by defeat in the field, the North, for the first time in its history, brings in conscription. And so now that philosophical argument of whether you fight or not to fight has real life consequences. The draft is a peculiar one, which would be utterly inconceivable in either the 20th or the 21st century, because most famously there was the commutation. For $300, you could buy your way out of the draft. And this was, trying to be neutral about it, in recognition of the fact that there was no welfare state, that if the salary holder of the family was drafted, the family would be very quickly destitute. And in that situation, of course, they weren't going to send a man to fight. This apparently carried no social opprobrium. Grover Cleveland was the sheriff of Buffalo at this time, and he invoked this because he was the sole means of support for his sister and a mother. And he went on to become governor of the state and then served 2 terms in the presidency, voted in largely by veterans. And they seem to have no problems with it. So, as I said, there was no social opprobrium attached to it, and it was widely done. Quakers almost immediately concluded that this was inappropriate. This is the $300 was going to go to the war effort. And it was just as bad giving $300 to the War Department as it was fighting the war itself. You couldn't get out of it that way. So I thought it ended at that point. I have discovered something which, again, I have never seen referred to in any history. Apparently there was, however, a provision in the commutation. Or it was not, that's not right. There was a ruling by Quakers with regard to the commutation that if the young man drafted didn't know that someone had paid his commutation for him, and the person who had paid the commutation was not a Quaker, there was no reason to bring any action against the drafted individual by meeting. Once again, that sounds shocking, but you have to remember the point I made earlier. Quakerism at this time is about looking after the peace in your own soul. So in that situation, as I've outlined it, if the draftee doesn't know, and the person who paid the commutation is not a Quaker, what's the concern for the Friends meeting? And that is clearly the logic that underscores it. But by this time, as you can well understand, if you're of a somewhat cynical mind, you can easily understand the situation. Draft notice is received. A relative of the draftee goes to a non-Quaker and explains the situation. The non-Quaker, like even the lad, pays the commutation without the lad knowing, no problem. All of a sudden, the Quaker is off the hook. We know that many commutations were paid. And again, they are wrapped up in that same maddening language that I had quoted before. There have been a few commutations. Well, how many? Yeah, but we know this was done. So there was a way out of the payment of the commutation. Quakers, however, were very concerned about this. And when Quakers were very concerned, at least Philadelphia Quakers were very concerned, their immediate reaction was to send a delegation to Washington. In the more innocent time, they were routinely received by President Lincoln. It's said that Abraham Lincoln actually liked receiving Quakers because they didn't want jobs. And that he was thrilled to actually have people come to the White House who weren't asking for a job. So he was perfectly happy to have Quakers because they weren't asking for a job. Or they would go to Secretary Stanton. Secretary Stanton is always Secretary of War, Edwin Master Stanton, whose had relatives who were Quakers, but not a Quaker himself. He is often seen as the bad cop to Lincoln's good cop, particularly in this issue of mercy for petitioners in this regard. And Lincoln was the first to admit that he used Stanton in this way. Someone once asked Lincoln why he kept Stanton as Attorney General, as Secretary of War, because nobody particularly liked him. He was a disagreeable personality. And Lincoln said, there was a man where I come from who had a dog that was half blind, only had 3 legs, and only had a quarter of its teeth, but could still beat any other dog in a dogfight in the county. How does he win? They asked his master. He's slow, he gums, can't see. The master said, absolutely. And he's the meanest son of a bitch in the whole county. That's why Lincoln kept Stanton around. And it's perfectly true. Lincoln signed the promotions, Stanton signed the courts martial. The dirty work was done by Stanton, so that Lincoln could remain above it all. Stanton, however, called a number of Quakers together to discuss this, hash it out. And he listened to the Quakers, and he concluded his counteroffer was that he would make sure that Quaker commutations went to hospital care. With a term that almost, as you read the words, you can almost hear it say, I can't do better than that. This is it, the bottom line. Quakers went away at the famous Baltimore Conference, which appears to be both Orthodox and Hicksite Quakers, although they never say it. But it's certainly Hicksite, because Baltimore was a Hicksite meeting, hosting it. But it appears to have some Orthodox Quakers too. They conclude they can't accept it because the basic idea of hospital care, military hospital care, is to fix people up so they can go back and fight more. And that they can't support. At this point, Stanton more or less throws up his hands and says, I've done all I can, tough luck. And once again, the story normally ends there because it conforms with the well-known personality of Edwin Master Stanton, which was being unpleasant to everybody, because this was part of his role, and he understood that that was part of his role. However, the record is kind of odd, because almost on a case-by-case basis, he lets Quakers off almost as fast as Lincoln does. And Lincoln lets Quakers off very quickly. He commutes Quaker sentences, he sends Quaker boys home from military prison at a fairly rapid rate. But so does Stanton. And that's the interesting part. Stanton doesn't conform to his hard-nosed role, which is, he's earned that honestly in other areas, I'll tell you, particularly in the awarding of contracts. But in that area, at least among Quakers, and although he has said, you've had enough. I've had enough of it, when they reject the hospital proposal. Quakers, one by one, are, if they petition, they go through the procedures, they're sent home. or they are not called up unless called for, and then they're never called for. So if they register and then go home, they have to wait by the telephone, more or less, or the equivalent. But the telephone is never going to ring. So, and this happens over and over again throughout not only the Philadelphia meetings, but other meetings as well. But it is certainly common in the Philadelphia area. So what you have, in other words, is a, I have to finish off with one remarkable moment. I've talked a great deal, of course, about Quakers and the dealings with Quakers based on principle, so forth. Then we have Senator Joseph Lane of Kansas, who on the Senate floor in late 1863 said, "I've had some dealings with Quakers, and I desire to say, for the edification of the senator from California, that it is perfectly ridiculous to attempt to force a Quaker into the ranks of the army. It cannot be done. And if you should succeed in doing it, he would be worthless as a soldier. Besides, the attempt to collect money from the Quakers in lieu of military service will cost the government $10, where they can obtain only $1, if they can get it at all. As a resort to pragmatism, I can scarcely imagine a more dramatic one, in an argument that was generally conducted on a highly principled level. But Lane, among others, was having none of it. His argument was exclusively pragmatic. So, the war grinds to its conclusion, and I want to just conclude on this. And this is slightly beyond my topic and title, but I think it's crucial, and I think it will be of interest to the audience. And the reason why it's beyond my title is because this has been the research I've been doing for the last 2 weeks. So the title I had to give the title about a month ago. New York Yearly Meeting Orthodox shows a lot of the same attitudes and responses as Philadelphia Yearly Meeting, both Hicksite and Orthodox. But I was astonished to turn the pages of the ledger. And of course, this is all in longhand. I'm reading people's handwriting, which is never pleasant. I was astonished when I discovered in 1867, New York Yearly Meeting started the Peace Association of Friends of America, whose principal role, as far as I can tell so far, and I've done most of the work on it, is to publish pamphlets. The report to New York Yearly Meeting of 1872 said that they had published 2 million pages of pamphlets. So this is not a small undertaking. And to send speakers out around the country to speak on topics connected with peace and pacifism. It's very clear that this association is set up, that it's first notably separate from New York Yearly Meeting. It is not the same organization. It has a president and a treasurer and other officers that are clearly separate from New York Yearly Meeting. So it's independent of that. Clearly designed, in other words, it seems to me, clearly from its title, to encourage all Quakers, Hicksite and Orthodox, to come and join and support this cause. Being a separate organization, it gets around the whole problem that Quakers have with proselytization, because it's not the meeting, separate organization. And it seems to me, it is the first great act by American Quakers of moving away from this internal examination, which has been at the basis of Quakerism really since George Fox, and the movement in an organized way into what we recognize as social reform. And so and it's very clear when you read the minutes of the creation in 1867, there's no doubt. New York Yearly Meeting's response is, the horror of war means we've got to do something. We can't allow 750,000 more men to die. We have to do something to stop this. And so for the first time, an organization is set up very specifically to invite other pacifist groups, other religions. It's not strictly Quaker. They send out materials to non-Quaker groups and ministers all across, particularly the Midwest. The headquarters is actually in Ohio, even though the basis was New York Yearly Meeting. What we see here, it seems to me, however, is, and this I seem to me the crucial argument, is the very beginning of the same impulse that leads to Friends Committee on National Legislation, AFSC, and even, of course, right down to those pamphlets, Pendle Hill. That impulse, it seems to me, can be traced back, in other words, to the reactions to the Civil War, and to the reactions of Quakers in the sense that turning inward is no longer enough. Something has to be done. That's what my research has turned up so far. Further reports from the front after I get the dust out of my fingers, as requested. Thank you very much. As Francisco will tell you, I very carefully moved the podium to keep the clock in view. So it's exactly 8:30. Those of you who teach will know that 55 minutes is exactly the time that you taught. You run out of gas at 56 minutes. So I'll take questions.
And I will be more than happy to pass this mic. You need to hold it like this. Yeah?
I don't need to hold it like this.
No,
That's
you
not been a problem that my
So
students
good
have
for
ever
you.
had, hearing me in the background.
So who will be the first? Susan.
Sandra.
Yeah. I don't know, this, I think you covered this, but it went a little over my head. Could you explain this Hittite and the Wilburites and the Orthodox?
Yeah,
I've read, I'm new to Quakerism, and I keep getting these vague references to, oh, the split in the North America in the 19th, but what exactly was it?
Elias Hicks was the cousin of Edward Hicks, the famous artist of Peaceable Kingdom, who you may have seen in books and so forth. But Hicks was a licensed minister who went around preaching what he saw as the gospel. He was concerned that Quakers were becoming too Bible-focused, and they were not allowing the inward leadings of the light and a direct relationship with God to lead them. And they were moving away from that, and they were becoming, putting it slightly in a slightly simplified fashion, a bit too much like other evangelical Christians who were flourishing at that time. This is the time of a flourishing of evangelical faiths in the 1820s. That they're on the rise everywhere. You can't miss it. And it would be scarcely surprising if Quakers hadn't been influenced by this going on all over the country. So Hicks says, back to contemplation of the inner light, skip this business of worrying about evangelical fervor and reliance on a literal interpretation of Scripture. Up turns Joseph Gurney. And Quakers are very interesting about Joseph Gurney. They always talk about what a pious and honorable, decent man he was. He's English, floating all around the United States, preaching his views of Quakerism. What they never say is that he was the member of one of the richest banking families in England. That in fact, you can actually argue that Joseph Gurney was kind of a rich playboy who got religion and had the wherewithal to let everybody know. But Joseph Gurney, when he comes to preach in the United States in about 1831, not 1831, 1821, sorry. What he says is, no, you got to turn to Scripture. You've got to follow this evangelical movement, because that's the one true way. Yes, George Fox said, those of you who believe in, quotes the 3rd chapter of the Gospel according to St. John, where he says, those of you who follow me, these I will call my friends, hence the name of the organization. But we also know that a literal interpretation of Scripture is what was also assumed too. And you can't get away from that. So this has to be a scriptural-based religion. It doesn't work otherwise. It's not Christian, and it's dangerous if it isn't. As I said, that's a horribly simplified account, but that begins the division between the two sides. And they begin to, had they been 11th century Greeks, they would be hurling excommunication orders at each other, but they don't do that because they're not 11th century Greeks. But they do, however, stop talking to each other. Enter John Wilbur. John Wilbur remains with the Orthodox faction. But he says, basically, and I'm doing him injustice by the simplification, but it'll work. You're both wrong. You both are too extreme. You Hicksites have to recognize that the Bible is still pretty important. You Orthodox, you have to recognize that that inward leading is still important as well. And you can't have one without the other, to both sides. So the Wilburites remain with the Orthodox, but spend most of their time criticizing Gurney for having led the Orthodox astray. And that is the principal division. Now, in very rough terms, probably the Hicksites are slightly larger in number than the Orthodox, and the Wilburites are never more than a relatively small minority. I mean, 10, 15% or thereabouts. In very rough terms, and that's going to vary tremendously. There are some areas like Philadelphia where they're relatively evenly balanced. Baltimore is overwhelmingly Hicksite, for instance. However, and there's divisions, actually the divisions that you can follow in Philadelphia if you're of a sociological point of view, which is that the urban areas tend to be Orthodox and the rural areas tend to be Hicksite. And that argument, if you follow it through sociologically, says that it's the old elites in the countryside who are essentially swelling to the old order, follow the inward leanings, and it's the new money in the city that says follow the evangelical tradition that is occurring all across the country. And so a somewhat skeptical person would say that this actually reflects the changes in society rather than any real religious movement. But that's the sort of three-way split. And the Friend is the Gurneyite publication. Friend's Intelligencer is the Hicksite, and Friend's Review is the Wilburite publication. They all have their newspaper that look almost identical to each other and read very similarly.
This group that you say was formed following the Civil War, who were telling Quakers, we must stand up against war, period. Did they make any qualification whatsoever about why the Civil War was fought? Not that it was fought to free the slaves, it definitely was not. However, that did become a component. Was there any recognition of that fact?
No, they're moving past. They've drawn a line under that. I suspect, and this is just my suspicion, there's nothing I'm having written down, I suspect they know that's how to sow dissent. What they're looking for is how do you build unity. And you build unity with a title like the Treaty of Washington. That's the treaty that the United States had with Britain for payments for the damage that the Confederate raiders that were built in Britain had done to the Union Navy, right? Which the Treaty of Washington and the effect of the gospel on settling national disputes. War on Christian Principles is another title. What is war? And you look at the text, and it's very firmly not just the United States. They get to Europe very quickly, and again, I suspect that's a safe area to discuss. And of course, topical. 1870-71, of course, the French and the Germans are fighting the Franco-Prussian Wars, and that's all over the newspapers. So it would be, they'd know about it. What was it? 12 reasons in favor of arbitration as a substitute for war. That's another title. He said they're all, and remember, international arbitration is untried at this time. Notion of people from a third country settling a dispute of two countries. This is almost cloud cuckoo land sort of stuff. No one's tried this before. So those sorts of topics are what they're publishing. In addition, of course, I should add, because it's a long one, an account of the suffering of members of North Carolina yearly meeting in support of their testimonies against war. In other words, all the horrible things that the Southerners had done to North Carolina Quakers, which of course, given the fact their audience is Northerners, is going to be a very popular topic. No, they stay away from that. They are, as I said, it's classic 19th century pamphlet. They're published on paper that make newspapers look thick and heavy bonded. I mean, they're really deep. I was literally I was a little afraid they were going to fall apart in my hands as I was reading them. That they are still with us is an amazing of archival salvage. And but as I said, and often just 3 or 4 pages. Keep it short. People will pay attention. Write at length, they're not going to read it. That problem. So they're hitting the popular market, and they've decided to really go for the mass appeal. And so I think it's absolutely essential that you understand how this fits into the development of Quakerism, and that this is the impact. To my mind, this is probably the most important impact of the Civil War. Is that Quakerism now becomes much more outward-looking rather than inward-looking.
You described a time when peace within yourself was considered vital in Quakerism. Can you explain why?
I alluded to a little bit. I think it's George Fox's ruminations as he wanders around Lancashire. This was a man for whom the Enlightenment and all of its belief that the rational mind could solve problems had yet to come. He isn't living in a rational world, in the world of the rational Enlightenment. He's living 100 years before. They don't necessarily see that there's going to be that man can, by thinking rationally, improve his condition. They believe that, of course, life in its natural state, saying nothing about changes, but life in its natural state is, as Thomas Hobbes said, solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. So how are you going to get through that and remain a godly person? And of course, again, I'm characterizing with a complicated argument, very, in too simple a term, but Fox's answer is you turn inside and you reject the outside world. You save your own spirit and your own internal leadings, and that will allow you to triumph over the ungodly outside. Because as I said, he doesn't reflect, I don't think Fox ever reflects that sort of enlightenment vision that if we all think rationally and work together, we can make life better for us.
And yet, as I read Fox's writing, he did not seem to lead a life of quietude. He seemed to lead a life of stirring everything up and wanting to change religious practices.
Yes, but the object of his stirring things up, and you're absolutely right, is not to build a huge social movement to improve the conditions of the poor, improve the positions in prisons, typical well-known social benefits or social equality. It's to make his views better known of how to improve yourself. It's how to follow the leadings of the inner life, so that you can be a godly person in what is always going to be an ungodly world. The Enlightenment argues you can make it a godly world. And that to me is something that is profoundly not the presupposition of George Fox. It's how does the individual make it in an ungodly world?
Thank you.
Sure.
Judge? It's a little discouraging to hear how few friends seem to have been involved in the abolition movement. Perhaps a little bit surprising, given the efforts by Woolman and Benezet and others to address the evils of slavery. But it sounds as though that was primarily to free themselves of slavery. Although I know that Woolman felt that slave owners were doing great damage, not only just to the enslaved peoples, but to themselves by holding slaves. Were there actions that Friends, short of military service, that Friends meetings encouraged to try to bring about the abolition of slavery? Or was that simply not a widespread concern of Friends at that point?
Because I didn't have an extra 3 hours, I spared you the petitions to the United States Congress and the Pennsylvania State Legislature and the New Jersey State Legislature and the Delaware State Legislature that I have read in depth. And that they're easy to read because I usually read them printed rather than handwritten. So they're much easier to read. But no, it was like Whittier, but not like Garrison. Quakers were having to work within what we might say within the system. So they agitated, they militated, and of course they also, when they could get away with it,
The Underground Railroad.
the Underground Railroad. When they could get away with it, they not only ran the Underground Railroad, but they supported people who ran the Underground Railroad.
Right.
But the actual acts of violence. I mean, when William Lloyd Garrison burns the United States Constitution, because of course it's a pro-slavery document, it allows for slavery, that essentially turns Quakers off. Because the symbolism of the act is clearly violent. I mean, it's, and they couldn't accept that. One of the things that you can, in their various petitions to Congress, the President, and so forth, one of the most repeated expressions is usually the beginning of paragraph 2. I'm getting to be familiar with how these things are constructed. We love our country. We're proud of being Americans. We love our country. They're assuring their public officials they're patriotic. They want to make absolutely sure that they're working within the system. Now, as I said, Garrison was perfectly happy to ignore the system or criticize it, but they aren't. Because, again, the official line is pacifism first.
Thank you.
Good one, Ron.
Thanks. Just a quick question. Is it true that it was a Wilburite, along with one other gentleman, who first accomplished powered flight?
Well, his name was Wilbur, right? And his brother was Orville. But, wait, I have my answer. Yes, I can do this one. I'm sorry, that's not my period. I can't comment on that. I've always wanted to get off of it. I always wanted to, students won't accept that, but I can try to. That's 1903, it's after my time. Oh.
I think I can be heard.
Yeah, the thing is that I need it for the
Hold on,
recording.
Mr. Paul.
Yeah.
Yeah, do you have any estimates on how many Quakers actually served in the Union Army? And were there any Quakers that became casualties as far as wounded, killed, POW, etc.?
Oh yeah, there were certainly wounded, killed, and POW. That's the question that historians have argued over, or at least a few historians who actually worry about these things, argue over is the number. There's no question that they served. I mean, Thomas Hand, for instance, is willing to go out on a limb and says, well, it was at least 300 in Indiana. Well, that's pretty safe, because I actually think it's probably closer to 1,000 in Indiana. He's not wrong. He's not wrong, it's at least 300. And so, but I'm also sympathetic because, and as I said, that's why I named this lecture A Few Exceptions. Because there is this level of kind of, well, to me, it's kind of maddening obscurity about the way in which the wording covers up the exact elements going on here. But I understand why that occurs because it's a way of dealing with the real pain this was causing meetings and families and friends and so on. The whole, it's a very small world after all. We're only dealing with 200,000 people in a population of 25 million. And the only area of the South in which there's any number of Quakers